Dr. Bolton. He co-founded the MedTech National Foundation. He has done a PhD in surgical technology and the application and implementation in middle to low income developing world countries.
Essentially, it all boils down to doing as much as you possibly can with the resources that you have available to you.
We're specifically at a very interesting time where in the world, everyone is now trying to have such a big impact at scale. ChatGPT raised the bar pretty high.
If I gave you an unmet clinical need and you have unlimited time, you have unlimited money and unlimited resources, you'd find it very easy to solve. But if I then said that you solve the same problem, but you've got all of these constraints around you, then you actually have to think and challenge yourself as to why you're making those decisions. You have a much more intentional thought process when you're doing it.
They're expecting these products to come in and almost fix all of our problems at once.
A lot of people said, why are we trying this perceived higher tech stuff when we don't even have the basics in place? I only can cope with doing the clinical stuff because I get to explore my extra interests.
Do you think you're at risk of spreading yourself too thin?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm always at risk of that.
Frugal innovation. I'm going to start off this podcast by asking you, what is frugal innovation? What does it mean? To me, before I recorded this episode, frugal very much had negative connotations. It meant to me cheap, tacky, something that was cost effective, but kind of simple and plain almost. The term frugal and innovative were two words that I hadn't really heard before until I started researching into my guest, Dr. Bolton. He is an academic neurosurgical registrar who is training in Leeds, and he has done a PhD in surgical technology and the application and implementation of tech in middle to low income developing world countries, and how opposite to today's society where everyone is trying to create these wonder innovations, like how large language models are set to revolutionize healthcare and fix every one of our problems. We'll talk a little bit about frugal innovation, but from the point of view of developing small, lean processes and solutions with the existing tech we already have. Along with the term frugal innovation, collaboration is another term that came up time and time again. And we talk about this importance of collaboration and working across an interdisciplinary team, and how in a world which sometimes champions and celebrates individual heroes, how it's actually just more fun to grow together. Will is a personal inspiration of mine because he co-founded the MedTech National Foundation, an organization which connects interdisciplinary professionals across multiple different industries to come together and spin out collaborative academic research projects or tech devices or companies. And I speak really highly of the MedTech Foundation because the reason I got into HealthTech and MedTech is honestly just because of a chance event where I happened to attend a hackathon that they were hosting, and through that I was then catapulted into opportunities that I otherwise wouldn't have had. This episode is extremely interesting, so if you enjoy it, please make sure you hit that follow button. It means the world to me if you just hit that subscribe button, whether it is Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. It's free and it just helps the channel to grow, so why not? I begin this episode by asking Will to provide some context into what we need to understand about him, to understand his vision for causing impact at a global scale. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy.
As a doctor with a brain and two hands, or as a surgeon, you can operate and hopefully help one patient at a time when you're operating, right? And you might operate on several thousand cases in your career, and that's really great, and you should definitely, that's something that's incredibly meaningful and you should pursue that. But if you are a surgeon that does that, but can also research, invent new devices, invent new services that go on to benefit many people in different areas and in different times, when you're not even around anymore, then you might benefit many millions of people. And when someone explained that to me, it inspired me to think, actually, how can I maximize the benefit I can provide? And so I think that's where the passion came from to start with. And then technology, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, more, but technology is just the main bit of all of that for me. Technology is the kind of area that I research.
I'm specifically interested, and I want to talk to you about the MedTech Foundation that you co-founded, because whenever anyone asks me how I got involved in health tech, MedTech, digital health, this whole space, I always signpost them and tell them my first initial event that I went to was the MedTech Hackathon, and from that kind of sparked my interest in this whole space, and then led me to want to change the direction of my journey going forward and start tailoring my portfolio per se around this exciting, innovative space that isn't really talked about at medical school. So tell me a little bit about the challenges that you found, which led you to set up the MedTech Foundation.
That's great to hear. One of the most enjoyable parts of my professional life when someone tells me that they've interacted with something like the MedTech Foundation and that's inspired them to start their journey or to scale up their journey in tech and digital health and innovation. So thanks for that. Keep going. You're doing amazing stuff. But yeah, the MedTech Foundation was one of my first kind of big projects towards the end of my medical school. And I got invited to a research meeting with a research group that was specifically around healthcare technologies and developing them and getting them adopted and accessed into the NHS. When they were doing their introductions around the room, there were a couple of surgeons, consultant surgeons, there were a couple of engineers, a robotics engineer, mechanical engineer, there was a physicist, some other scientists from the university. There were a couple of founders and leaders in industry organizations around the room and trialists, people who do the clinical studies and so on. And they were discussing all these projects in a really joined up way. And it was just amazing to see. And it got me crystallized in my mind that this is clearly the way that we should be doing real world innovation and technology development for medicine, in this interdisciplinary fashion with all of these key disciplines represented. And then when I went back to normal lectures and stuff at med school, I realized that, I reflected and thought, actually, normally it's very siloed. You just spend time with the medical school. You very rarely get to do much with other schools in the university and other disciplines outside of healthcare. So because of that, we decided to set up a student version of that research group effectively. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could do that with all the different students represented? So the main groups that we had initially set up were medicine and engineering, but we were completely open. So we did have some physics students, some chemist students. We had some law students. We even had art students. We had lots of business students. And the main thing that we did really was we did a series of workshops in an innovation program. So that on an evening over a couple of months, we took a bunch of lecturers and other surgeons and clinical speakers and just took the participants through an innovation program, kind of almost like a boot camp. And then at the end, they pitched their ideas to solve real unmet needs. And then we facilitated them applying for funding and project work to take their idea further forward. And we did that in Leeds for a few years and got some really good academic output, also delivered some new technologies, got some really good use cases and case studies. And then we actually got some funding from the National Institute of Health Research, the NIHR, to expand what we're doing in Leeds to many universities across the UK.
And whether it is setting up the MedTech Foundation or even the work you've done in your PhD, some of the research papers that I ended up reading, there's a common theme throughout, and it's working in collaboration across this interdisciplinary team. And that really does stand out throughout your career. Whatever type of content you produce, it is very clear on the emphasis of collaboration. And so the question I want to ask you is interesting to get your perspective, because traditional kind of entrepreneurial programs, for example, the NHS Clinical Entrepreneurship Program, they exist to build up the individual. They champion around building the individual, and then they go on and build their innovative product and go forward. But I guess your approach is a little bit different. I think that sometimes this collaborative approach is forgotten. So it'd be great to hear your perspective on the importance of collaboration.
From a science point of view, from a purely academic point of view, I saw it firsthand and know it now for a fact that it's just the most effective way of getting good science done, by working with different disciplines. Number one is you want to get your results. You want to get good quality results published and disseminated, and then you want to translate those results into patient change somehow through spinning out as a business, through changing policy and pathway. There's loads of ways that you can translate the results. But in order to get those results, in order to do that R&D side of things, I think working with the different disciplines is absolutely essential for impact. Number two, the second main reason to do it is I feel like it's just a lot more fun, because you get to I've met astrophysicists, I've met robots, I've met loads of really interesting people that have done all these amazing things. I met someone that was involved in the Mars rover programs and had a really big talk about how the stuff that they're learning from that could potentially benefit technology in healthcare, for example. So I think it's just much more fun and interesting, as well as being much more effective. And I think the final thing I'll say is I think actually in business, it's also very important to be very open to collaboration. I think that it's absolutely fine to make sure that what you're doing is benefiting you and your career. I don't think there's a problem with that at all. I think you need to do that. You need to make sure that the benefit could be coming from social, financial, moral reward, whatever the rewards are. That's fine. I think that's absolutely acceptable. But I just think that, look, if you think about it from a process point of view, it's just much more effective to do it with a big collaborative interdisciplinary team. You're going to get different points of view, people looking at the problem from different angles, coming at it from different backgrounds. It's why time after time, looking at diversity in teams and stuff always improves your output from that team. Essentially, if you increase the diversity, it will always improve it.
You mentioned throughout your work this term frugal innovation. You talk about it a lot, whether it is in some of your blogs or your research papers. And so my first question actually is, what does this mean? What does frugal innovation mean to you?
I first got really interested in frugal innovation when I was doing my PhD. So just for context, my PhD was looking at the ways that we can develop and evaluate new surgical technologies in low resource settings. Now, low resource settings, anything could be a low resource setting. I guess the NHS can be deemed that in lots of ways, as well as other healthcare settings. But I was particularly interested in looking at it from a low and middle income country context. Typically, these settings are present in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, for example, some parts of South America and so on, and others. And the same innovation methods and thought process that you may be accustomed to in a high income setting, like the UK, for example, they may not be as effective as frugal innovation, essentially, in that context. And I read a book by Navi Raja and Jaideep Prabhu. It's published in 2015, and it's called Frugal Innovation. And I'd recommend it to anyone who's interested. It's not purely about healthcare, although they have a lot of healthcare examples, but it's about looking at frugal innovation in business, in economics, and lots of different sectors, and why it makes sense. But essentially, it all boils down to doing as much as you possibly can with the resources that you have available to you. Or they say, they put it better, do more with less, kind of thing. And I think for me in healthcare, it's really important to understand that it's not about a cheap fix or a tacky solution. Like sometimes frugal implies a bit cheap, a bit, subpar. I think that we still need to ensure that the standards of care are maintained. Frugal innovation is about providing an elegant fix to a problem, neat solution, a neat fix, basically. Thinking, you might say, outside the box, kind of lateral thinking to solve a challenge locally.
We're specifically at a very interesting time where in the world, everyone is now trying to have such a big impact at scale. ChatGPT raised the bar pretty high, and people are looking to, I guess, create these drastic wonder innovations that we talked about just before I hit the record button. Large language models, generative AI. They're expecting these products to come in and almost fix all of our problems at once. But you're obviously suggesting actually to fix one small problem at a time by developing lean processes and solutions with the existing tech. So tell me a little bit about how we can repurpose the existing tech and find innovative ways to use it and think outside the box and implement these existing technologies, but innovate frugally.
Yeah, I think another way to think about it is if I asked you to solve a problem, if I gave you an unmet clinical need and just said, Ash, can you just solve it now? And you have unlimited time, you have unlimited money and unlimited resources, you'd find it very easy to solve because you'd just use the might of your resources to available to do it. But if I then said that you solve the same problem, but you've got all of these constraints around you, then you actually have to think and challenge yourself as to why you're making those decisions. So you have a much more intentional thought process when you're doing it. And I think that's another way to think about it it's almost like a mindset, to be quite honest. It doesn't mean that a frugal innovation doesn't have to be the same thing done differently. It doesn't have to be a repurposed device. It doesn't have to be necessarily a cheaper version of the same device. Frugal innovations are often cheaper versions, but a lot of digital tools are what I would have lots of frugal properties. For example, an app that can help with training, for example, healthcare. There's 7.5 million workforce deficit across the world and from healthcare. Imagine if you could train them, but using smartphones that the majority of medically trained people have in the world, even in low middle income countries. That would be, I'd consider, a pretty neat fix, or part of a neat fix to a problem. So I have no problem with people using what's traditionally perceived as high tech in a frugal way. It's also about the way that you use it. I think what's attractive about frugal innovation is the potential to benefit large numbers of people at the fringes of society that had previously been neglected and so on, and opens up new economic opportunities and markets in that respect because no one's servicing that unmet need. So if your frugal innovation can tap into that and access it, say if it was a chat GPT powered chatbot that could identify surgical site infection by asking a questionnaire, like, that would be, I think, pretty frugal. That would be really neat. It's far cheaper than paying for most medical staff, and it could help anyone with an internet connection, basically. I think that's really nice. On the other hand, from a device point of view, a frugal innovation example I often give is called the Xenoscope with an X. It's from an American company, and that basically looked at the laparoscope. So for doing keyhole surgery, which is analogous to an endoscope, you could put that in any organ that you would normally put an endoscope in. And they just said, why does it have to be thousands of pounds? Why? Essentially, it's a camera on a stick, and that camera has to talk to a screen. So they basically did just that. They just stripped it right back, figured out what the bare minimum functionalities would be, so like the minimum required specifications in the camera, minimum required specifications in the light, how durable should it be, and all these kinds of factors. And they produce one that costs $85, and you can plug it into anything with a screen, your phone, laptop, TV monitor, old stacks, whatever. That could benefit anyone that needs endoscopic surgery or laparoscopic surgery. Another great example is the Lifebox pulse oximeter project. So just Lifebox, just Google that, and they're a charity NGO that basically just said the only piece of equipment on the WHO checklist that's mandated is a pulse oximeter. And then they did a survey and realized that most theaters on the planet don't have one, or that it doesn't work. And I've heard stories of where the team haven't been able to measure oxygenation, and there's been a disastrous outcome from that. They literally just said, what are the bare minimum required specifications to do the job as good as to the standard that we would want to? What does that core functionality look like? They came up with a technical specification for it, and they just published it and just said to the world, they published it specifically for industry to look at, and just said, who can build it for this much money? And now they've distributed, I think last count it was over 20,000 pulse oximeters across the world. And think about the amount of lives that's saved, and people can now access surgery safely, whereas they couldn't before. That's the power of frugal innovation, I think, and that's why I think people should think about it. And I think the final thing I'll say, is you mentioned quite a lot of high-tech, traditionally high-tech. I think high-tech is absolutely perfect for frugal innovators. What would be really disruptive is a frugal robot that can do surgery, or from my specialty point of view, or a frugal neuronavigation software for guidance during surgery, for example. So even though they're traditionally really expensive things to build, if you can make them with novel actuators, low cost equipment, whatever, if you can think about it with a frugal set of principles, and you could make a low cost but just as effective version, that would be phenomenal. And that's, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about that. It's probably a long-term dream, but it's something that I'd love to be able to do.
The passion definitely speaks volumes. I can almost feel your passion from here, which is great. And your PhD was centered around surgical devices, technology, but specifically focusing on implementing them in developing countries. And so tell me the focus of your PhD, because during my MI5 stalk that I did of you before this podcast episode, there were so many different buzzwords that were thrown around, and I wasn't actually sure what there was a specific focus on to do with your PhD. Was it AI? Was it VR? So talk to me a little bit about your PhD and how you are implementing these frugal innovations in these third world countries.
Anyone who's done a PhD or who's thinking about doing a PhD will realizes or will come to realize this. When you're actually going through it, you often don't know the full direction that you're going in, and you end up going off in tangents and down different routes. But the central theme, the driving theme, was the current process that technologies are evaluated. So generating the evidence to get technologies adopted in a high-income country context probably isn't fit for purpose in a low resource setting. That was what we found out anyway. And there's one particular set of evaluation guidelines called the IDEAL framework, which I encourage your listeners to have a look if they're interested online. And that's done a really amazing job at systematically defining the types of study, the kind of evidence that you need at each development stage as you're developing a surgical technology or surgical innovation. But what I was interested in is how can we adapt that to make it more suited to those low resource environments. Number one, what extra methods or different methods may be needed? There'll be a huge emphasis on your health economic analysis, your economic argument in very low resource constrained settings. And there may be extra training required to run the studies, for example, or support to run the studies that you may be able to take for granted in different settings. And the other area was around, if I have a technology that is already being used in the UK, for example, what kind of studies or evidence do I need if I want to start using that in a different context, but for the same indication? So when the indication is the same and the technology is the same, but the context is different, things like infection rates may be different, other local challenges, unforeseen things may be different. So what types of studies do you need to do for that? So the PhD was about putting some methodology around that, constructing essentially a sub-framework to the ideal framework called the Global Surgical Innovation Ideal Framework, so that researchers and other surgeons and researchers can use that to develop their own program of research and to evaluate their own innovations and get them adopted in their context. You mentioned VR, and one of the chapters are looking at how do I generate that evidence for that study and how do I test my study designs, essentially. And so one of the studies I looked at to test those methods was the use of mobile phone-based immersive training tools to train at scale, essentially. Even the study that we did, over 90% of healthcare professionals, even in some of the poorest countries in the world, still have smartphones, and internet access is improving, and most people working in healthcare can afford some internet, although there is challenges there. So I was like, this feels like a really good target to go for. We already have the device. They don't need to buy a VR headset. So we partnered with an application-based mobile phone solution, and ran an RCT looking at its effectiveness there. That's why that was just one of the examples that we used. And then since then, that study went well and showed promise. And so now we're expanding with other organizations, and we've got part of a team that's got a whole library of global health, VR and other immersive 360 video content that people access all over the world now. And that's been evaluated and adopted as part of the methods that we developed. So that was really exciting. So that's a high level overview of the PhD, but I think it is online. So if people ever did want to read any more, then feel free. I'd love it if you read even a couple of words of it, or if you ever want to find out more, then I'm happy to go into more detail.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I find it so interesting hearing academics talk about their PhDs, because obviously it's years of work that they're trying to condense into 2-3 minutes of speaking. And so it's interesting to see what they come up with in those 2 minutes, because obviously what you've said is only just literally a small, shallow portion, the tip of an iceberg, which is so much deep and so much time and effort went into it. And so, Will, you wear many hats, so obviously from whether it is you're a researcher, you have a strong passion for academia, you're a practicing surgeon, you're a co-founder of Flux HealthTech, so you're obviously dabbling into entrepreneurship now. And so there is a notion where the most successful people are a bit obsessive and they channel all their energy into this one singular passion, but you're venturing into these multiple different spheres. So what is your take on this? Do you think you're at risk of spreading yourself too thin?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm always at risk of that. And I think, it's a good question. It got me to reflect on it, actually. And I think finding that core thread that kind of runs through the things that you devote your time to, I think is important. And it takes a lifetime to figure that out, basically. And it gets updated regularly. It's okay if we're not sure now, or we're still figuring that out. But I think going back to what I said at the start, I felt like with my professional life, I wanted to try and be of service to as many people as possible for as long as possible. And for me, it was a bit of a numbers game. I just came to the realization that to do that, I had to do more than just the direct care that I deliver. And research is a well-trodden, like academia, like doing academic training and stuff, is relatively well-trodden thing for people to do in this country. So I use that as a vehicle to explore those interests, and then all of my research has been in tech, as I've said. So I think and tech naturally leads you to interact with organizations, businesses, corporations, and so on. I think if you imagine a Venn diagram with three circles, and you have clinician, academia, and industry, and they overlap. I think what I try to do is I try to have bits on my project list and on my CV, ultimately, that kind of I could put into each of those circles to try and paint the picture that I was someone that would be in the middle of that Venn diagram, because I felt like being able to, I'm not an expert in any of those things. I think what you want to become what I wanted to become an expert in is a person who can speak all of those different languages between those different disciplines, see the connection, and then execute to achieve the goal, essentially, by pulling all those different team members apart together. Sorry. So like knowing the clinical so as a surgical trainee, I know the clinical context really well. I work on the front line of the NHS. I know the clinical context really well. I've got a very good understanding of research methodology, so I can identify how to translate what I understand there into a research question that could get funded, that could actually deliver data, because we need evidence to practice medicine overall. And then I like to be able to, I like to think that I can then connect that understanding to an economic argument, which may be attractive to a company, essentially. Because ultimately, scientists don't make the technology, they don't make the devices, they don't package them necessarily, unless they want to. Often a company does all that. Being at that interface and being what I'm trying to develop as an expert that can do those things.
You initially started off that question by visualizing a Venn diagram with 3 different circles, and you stood in the center. And I was going to stop you there actually and ask you, is that actually realistic though in the real world, where you position yourself to be at the center of all those 3 different spheres? But then your answer almost somewhat changed into specifically placing yourself in the center, and then so you have your almost central circle, but then attaching the other things around it, whether it's entrepreneurship now. I don't know. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to describe? So instead of having a Venn diagram with yourself in the middle, what you've actually just described is having yourself in the middle and then finding what you can then expand into and channel that initial focus into these other areas and these other paths.
I think that it's all about, in terms of can you do it, it's all about your time, essentially. That's your main resource limiting that you've got, is you only have so much time. So I think that it would be very difficult to do, it's impossible to do all 3 of those things full time, I think. I think you definitely have to be willing to work more than a full-time person would work. So I think we all recognize that if we're interested in medicine, basically, I guess we recognize that's a potential, staying late and stuff. But I think it's ultimately who's going to help you free up some of your time and pay for it and support your time. So that's why academic training is attractive, because it gives you protected time that's paid for as part of your training to do alongside your clinical training, to do your research and so on. That's why clinical entrepreneur program is there's attractive avenue. And there are other avenues where you can get time protected, paid for, to do those extra things. And I think the other thing to realize is I don't think you can be an expert, like a full expert in all of them at the same time, simultaneously. I think that what I mean by trying to put yourself at the center of that Venn diagram is that you have experience, you have gone through some exercise in each of those. As a doctor, you'll be nailing the clinical one automatically, right? For the research one, you've gone through a project, you know what it's like to get ethics, to do the data, to do the study design, to get good data, to publish it. You know the barriers to research, what kind of things make a good research question and a good study. And from an industry point of view, you've spoken to a lot of companies, you may have you might have been a medical advisor to companies, or you may have founded your own company, you've gone through a bit of that process. You don't necessarily have to be like, no, you're not going to be like the CEO of Amazon, Surgeon General, and then also chief investigator of all the trials in the world. You're not going to do that. But because you've had experience in those areas, when you do, your common thread is getting this new piece of kit that you've developed adopted. You know the pathway pretty well, and you know the different people that you know when you're going to have to do that study, what type of study it's going to be. You might get someone else to help you do it, but you know what to do. So you can be the driving force through that whole process, essentially.
It's definitely a super interesting narrative. I'm trying to understand a bit better about what my connecting thread is, though I'm very early in my clinical journey as well. But as I'm starting to have these other interests now, whether it is digital or even content creation, I'm trying to thread this connection between all of them and see where my place lies in educating the next generation of clinicians to think beyond tomorrow, hence the podcast.
That sounds like you've got your thread there. That sounds perfect. What you're doing is really timely as well and really needed.
Throughout this episode, we've talked about some buzzwords, AI, VR, robotics. And I wanted to ask you, is there somewhat of a juxtaposition of talking about implementing these innovative techs when actually we need to first address the fact that people don't know how to use them. So how can they expect to start being more reliant on this technology, and how can we ensure they're not just shiny tools, but tools that actually enhance healthcare?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And people have said things, people have said similar things to me when we were talking about, I was talking about one of my PhD studies is looking at mobile phone VR to train surgeons in low and middle income countries. A lot of people said, why are you even going for that when they don't even have X? Why are we doing this when they don't have a basic operating theatre light and all this? Why are we trying this higher tech, perceived higher tech stuff when we don't even have the basics in place? And I try and rationalize it by saying before many countries in Africa never installed landlines. They didn't need to. They just went straight to mobile phone because mobile phone adoption was so quick. There's no need to install a whole network that's not going to be used. Everyone carries around a mobile phone in their pocket. So I know what you're saying. Why are we trying to adopt AI when I can't even find a keyboard at work that's got the right number of keys, or the Wi-Fi at work never works, or I'm still using a pager or a fax machine? I promise you, I get that. I have to do that all the time as well, and have to remind myself that the situation that we're in when it comes to technology in the NHS. But I don't think that means that we shouldn't be focusing on the emerging innovations in the future, because one, focusing on the things that are coming in from the front essentially helps us, I hope, pull ourselves towards a better situation, because we're it's becoming increasingly obvious that we're far behind. The technology that I use at home that we're using right now is so much better than most technologies that we may use at work, for example. I think that focusing on that can help. And I think that rather than implementing a whole bunch of kind of more outdated legacy technologies, we don't have to go through this sort of stepwise progression. If we do have the option to use AI to kind of radically disrupt or revolutionize a process, say documenting ward rounds, for example, I think we should do that straight away. I think that would be perfect. We don't necessarily have to wait for anything in between. The key is always around your evidence generation. You have to generate evidence. And I'm not saying that research should be a barrier. I don't want this research to be cumbersome. I don't want it to be slowing innovation, which it can often do. So I'm not calling for unnecessary more research, for example. I'm just saying that, basically having a frugal evaluation that can tick your main criteria before you get something adopted safely and effectively. We should just do that for these emerging technologies in the specific use cases that we see is probably the lowest hanging fruit, and then take it from there. And I think that will begin pulling up the other areas of technology that we mentioned that I think need to be pulled up.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer there. And as we're closing up the podcast, Will, the different things you're doing, it's all about providing opportunities to others, whether it is through the MedTech Foundation or whether it is your latest venture, Flux HealthTech. So tell me about how, if there's a clinician out there, a medical student out there who is listening, wants to get involved in this space, how can they do that? How can they optimize, firstly, their portfolio to get involved? And then how can they actually find opportunities?
I think we spent a lot of this conversation talking about research and technology, which is where I've come from, where I definitely have more experience and years in. But it'd be great to talk about Flux HealthTech at the moment, just as we're coming to an end. I think it's a really exciting venture that we're embarking on. I'm one of four co-founders. Gideon Lem is our CEO, Angela Lamb's our COO, and Josh Burke is our CMO. And as you mentioned at the start, I'm the CTO, which is great. And we're all NHS doctors, and we're all passionate about innovation, training, and technology. Flux HealthTech really came from some of the frustration and pain that hopefully I've got across that we were feeling when we were doing other things like MedTech Foundation and so on. It's this lack of opportunities for clinicians to do things outside of their clinical training that they're interested in. Like I said, there's well-trodden pathway for academics, but there isn't really a super integrated, trodden pathway for other people who are just interested in, say, innovation or business, like we've said. So how do we provide opportunities for people who want to do that? And there's good reasons to try and solve that problem. It's not an understatement. There is a workforce crisis, and I know you're just about to qualify, so I don't want to put you off.
And you won't put me off more than anyone else has.
It's still it sounds cliche, I promise you, but it's still the best career. I'd definitely still do it. But it's I only can cope with doing the clinical stuff because I get to explore my extra interests. If I couldn't do the extra things like the innovation, research, technology side, I don't know that I could do full-time clinical work. To be quite honest, I have to do these extra things around it. And I think anything that can increase those opportunities, I hope, will make an impact on recruitment and retention into the NHS, because people often leave because they are lacking something, essentially. So if you can find out what they're lacking, like that ability to feel fulfilled in a different sector, developing those skills in a different area, getting paid more money, which is totally reasonable to want to do things that you get financially rewarded for, to give people those opportunities that they feel they're lacking, I think they're going to be more likely to stay. So that's where Flux HealthTech came from. And as you said, it's an internet marketplace. So people can register for free, log on, and you can basically do locums for health tech. So if you don't have to have done any before. We ask a bit of information about what kind of skills and experience you have, and then we can match you to opportunities that kind of meet your stage of experience and training and so on. Medical students can join, anyone from any specialty can join. Most jobs that we have on there don't necessarily need a specific grade or specialty. They're just looking for a medical professional or medically qualified person or a healthcare student. So yeah, and then you get to explore, you get to have a different experience with a different company or a different organization. You get paid for it. And if you're not that sure that you want to start that journey proper with an external organization, we have an academy where you can come and learn about innovation and develop your skills and get rewarded for that by essentially improving your portfolio so that you're more likely to get better jobs, essentially. So yeah, and I think it's going to be a huge part of the future. We've had hundreds of clinicians signed up, loads of companies have signed up, and we've got this really exciting opportunity here to take it hopefully to the next level and provide a reason to go into medicine, essentially, and to stay in medicine. We feel like we want to reward people who are on the front line of the NHS because, like I was saying to you, people who come and do a Flux experience with a company, if they're on the front line, they're much more likely to apply that knowledge to their daily practice, which is what we ultimately want. So yeah, so check us out. I'm sure it'd be great if you could pop the link in the post and stuff. And if anyone wants to reach out to talk about Flux more, I'm always more than happy to.
Fantastic. It's been my pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, Ash. Keep up the great work and good luck with everything.